Hey, my name's Alex and welcome to my YouTube channel. This is the place where I talk about things like philosophy and politics and identity and race and economics and psychology and at this point, look, pretty much anything. Today I am posting an interview that I did with the philosopher Peter Singer. I did the interview with my friend Liam in 2018, which is a little while ago, but we spoke about things which today are still ethical questions on the tip of our tongues. We spoke about the rise of artificial intelligence and whether there's any way we can configure our understanding of such things so that we will not be left in the dust as redundant things. We spoke about our relationship to consumption and our relationship to capitalism and how we should, perhaps think about reducing our carbon footprint. We tried to stay away from that though, because that's pretty much all Peter is ever asked. And we also spoke about, he gave us some love advice. He's been in a relationship for like 50 years. And so he told us some things about, how to stay in a relationship for 50 years. And you might be wondering, how did I get Peter Singer on my podcast? How did I get to interview him? And well, I'm a philosophy student at the University of Melbourne, and that's where he did his undergrad, and that's where he has been a professor for a long time, as well as at Princeton. And so he was teaching one of my classes, and I went up to him and said, hello. And that's all. If you're enjoying ALEKS Listens and you'd like to support it, you can do so by clicking the link below to Patreon or to PayPal, or, like, subscribe, tell a friend, whatever. Anyway, thank you. Bye.
Is there anything you can do when someone doesn't respond to a sound philosophical argument?
There are some things you can say to that, but in a way, the person who says, yes, I agree with your arguments, that it's wrong to eat whatever it is that person is loving, but nevertheless he just loves it, that's getting pretty close to the point at which you've run out of argument, right? What you can then do is to discuss, what are you living for? Do you get fulfillment and satisfaction out of your life? Do you have values that you think go beyond enjoying the food you eat? And would you perhaps have a more fulfilling and meaningful life if you lived in accordance with some values other than the values of a glutton, or not to be pejorative, maybe a gourmet.
Liam's a glutton.
But is that really going to satisfy you throughout your life and give you that meaning and purpose that most people crave? Mm-hmm. Now, maybe this guy's going to say, well, I don't crave it. I'm just happy to live from one moment to the next, and one pleasant sensation to the next. Mm. At that point, it does get a bit hard to push this much further.
See, I feel like I understand logic and reason, but only some of the time, because there are instances where when I'm particularly anxious about something, I feel like the anxiety just blocks any capacity to think logically, to think rationally. Do you think there's any way to get around this? Do you have any advice for anyone who feels like they're listening to Peter Singer talk, but maybe there's something getting in the way and stopping them from thinking logically?
Well, what you've described is really a psychological problem,
right.
About the fact that you sometimes get anxious and don't think logically. And I think you would acknowledge that you're making mistakes then, and you're not only making mistakes from an ethical perspective, excuse me, but you're quite possibly making mistakes from your own self-interest as well.
Right.
People do that when they're anxious or in some sort of state where they're not thinking calmly and clearly. They make decisions that they later regret because they end up harming themselves, or they end up harming someone they love or care for. So I think that's, maybe you need to go to a psychotherapist at that point and not to a philosopher.
Thank you for the diagnosis, Peter. Yeah, so on the topic of rational and logical thinking, I was wondering, me and Liam actually spoke about this. We've been talking about it quite a lot recently, but can someone who is an emotional thinker, so someone, who is high on the neurotic scale, can they also be a rational thinker? Because the reason why I ask this is because, people who tend to be emotionally unstable, can they be, you talk a lot about effective altruism, can they be good effective altruists when it's not coming from a place of logic or from a place of reason?
I certainly think there can be good, effective altruists who have strong emotions that motivate their altruism, motivate their giving. So, for example, many people, and I'd perhaps include myself among them, have strong emotions when you think of people suffering unnecessarily. A lot of, if you could say, is there a common thread in all the things I've written about, whether it's about effective altruism, about humans, about global poverty, about altruism, about legalizing voluntary euthanasia.
Right.
All of those things could be seen as response to the existence of unnecessary suffering.
Of course.
And I have an emotional response to that. I think I can defend that logically as well.
Right.
So to that extent, my answer would be yes. But you did have that word unstable in there, and that suggests emotions that change pretty rapidly and unpredictably and not under the control of our reflection and thought.
Right.
And that is likely to impair your effectiveness as an altruist, because there may be times when you don't care about suffering and you therefore don't do things which could easily prevent large amounts of suffering.
Right.
And later on you may regret that.
Right.
Or perhaps more commonly, you might fluctuate in who you care about. So you might care deeply and strongly about some people who are close to you at one point, and then at other times you may realise that actually you could do much more good by helping people who are strangers to you, but in much greater poverty, let's say. And so your actions are going to reflect the state of your emotions at that time, and you'll do less good than you would if you had a stronger sense of I want to do the most good that I can, and that will sometimes mean acting contrary to my emotional attachments for people who are close to me.
Right. Okay. I thought that we would deal with veganism and effective altruism quite briefly, because you've spoken so extensively about this on a million podcasts all over the world, so we didn't think...
Sure, I'm happy to talk about something different.
Okay, so speaking of something different, I'd like to jump onto the topic of AI, of artificial intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
So I was listening to a podcast, Radiolab, recently, and they said that they were interviewing someone from Volvo, and the person from Volvo said that in 2021, Volvo will release their first self-driving car. And so this means that, well, at least, the first thing that I thought of, being a diehard Peter Singer fan, I was like, utilitarianism. What does this mean? Does this mean that it actually means that there is going to be someone who is going to have to engineer the car to make a decision in a traffic accident. So this is, it is maybe a modern day trolley problem. So the question is, should we expect every engineer, or the engineer of these self-driving cars, to be a utilitarianist, so that every car crash injures the least amount of people? And let me just put one more thing to you. So imagine that you are in a car driving down a freeway at 100 kilometers an hour, and two fools stupidly run across the freeway in front of you. This means that potentially cars are going to be programmed to kill you every single time. So because, one life is less than two. Is this right?
Well, firstly, since it's a Volvo, and Volvo has a great reputation for internal car safety, I would hope they would design the car so that you can crash it at 100 kilometres an hour into a
This
brick wall.
podcast is not sponsored by Volvo.
and walk away. So that dilemma wouldn't arise. But, philosophers always are discussing hypothetical dilemmas, so I'll just accept the argument that you are in a situation where either you have to kill the driver or you have to kill two other people.
Right.
And I would agree that it would be best if the engineers did design the car so that it kills the fewest number of people, or injures the smallest number of people. But there's a problem, at least in a free market society, in that you want people to buy your cars, and if people don't buy your cars, there's no point in building them.
Right.
So if someone else thinks, Volvo is building these cars that will kill the driver in preference to killing two strangers.
Right.
I'm going to build a car that will always kill strangers rather than the driver, and I'm going to make that a big selling point of my car. Right? You're safer in my car because my car is
kill
programmed
other
to kill
people.
strangers, even 100 strangers. Right? You could imagine the car ad of the car ploughing into a huge crowd of strangers and the driver smiling and walking out.
Well, should work in marketing.
So the question is, so if let's just assume for the moment that would actually sell more cars.
Right.
Then you've got this prisoner's dilemma situation, because we would all ideally, if behind the veil of ignorance, we don't know whether we're going to be the pedestrian or the person in the car, the driver, we would all do better if we minimise the number of people killed.
Right, of course.
But if you have a situation where engineers are allowed to design cars to protect the driver and kill many people, and if we assume that people will preferentially buy those cars, then those cars are going to get made.
Right.
So the solution to that is not in the hands of the engineer; it's in the hands of the government.
Right. To make something uniform.
Or to enact that.
Right.
That's right. That cars ought to minimise casualties.
Okay. So we've spoken a lot about casualties, which has been rough. But just one last question on the topic. I imagine that many people would, well, at least I'm speaking on for myself. I struggle to deal or reconcile with the idea of an engineered death. So do you think then, after having spoken about engineers designing cars either to kill one person or to kill more people, depending on whether you're buying Volvo or Volkswagen, do you think it's okay for people to relinquish control over their lives and live to algorithms or live under the control of algorithms?
So I think we need to be a little more specific here, right? What do you mean by living under the control of algorithms?
I mean, maybe relinquishing control. So instead of, sitting behind the wheel and you get...
So in that particular instance, I say, yes, that's fine. If indeed, there's obviously a condition here.
Right.
If indeed it's true that the algorithms and the sensory perception mechanism of the car is such that in the long run, the car will cause fewer accidents, fewer harms through self-drive mechanisms than the typical driver would.
Okay.
Then I think if I have no reason to think that I'm any better than the typical driver, I think I should relinquish control of the car to those algorithms.
Okay.
But that's a pretty specific case where we recognise our own fallibilities, and it seems reasonable to do what will lead to the best consequences.
No, because I guess they're already doing that. In the sky we have self-driving planes, or planes that they can put on autopilot.
Right. Yeah, that's right. And I think this is happening, for example, in surgery, that we're getting auto-guided knives that are maybe more accurate than...
Right. They don't have the shaky hand of the scalpel of the surgeon. Yeah. Right. Okay. And on a similar topic, we're still talking about technology, but briefly, what do you think about big data and mass surveillance? So, on one hand, mass surveillance can stop criminal plots and all that kind of stuff, but do you think it's at a certain cost?
Well, there's a potential cost for abuse, clearly, and therefore... If you're talking about authoritarian governments which want to control their citizens and prevent any dissent, then there's clearly a danger here.
Right.
But to me, it's that danger question of abuse, and can we safeguard against abuse, and can we maintain a society in which the data is not abused?
Right.
That's the big question.
Right.
For some people, the question is simply one of the existence of the data anywhere, that the loss of privacy when many salient facts about me are recorded and stored somewhere.
Right.
And I'm less worried about that.
Okay.
I don't think we ought to... So, for example, I wouldn't not think about opting out of my health records just because I don't want knowledge about my health state to be on a computer somewhere.
Okay.
It doesn't bother me at all.
Right.
If... let's say that I did have some embarrassing disease that might be used to harm me, maybe whatever it might be.
Then it might change, right?
Right, and there was a risk that somebody would get this knowledge and would use it to damage my reputation, or blackmail me or whatever. Then I would be concerned.
Right.
But if it's simply being stored on machines and is properly protected against misuse, that's fine. And if, of course, the fact that it's there means that should I have an accident somewhere away from my local health records, there's a doctor who will know what the problems are and will be able to help treat me better, that's a big plus.
Okay. On to Liam. I think I've spoken for quite a while, so...
a bit of a gear change here. Peter, you've said that climate change is probably the single greatest moral challenge facing the world in the 21st century. And yet on the news every night, you'd be forgiven for thinking that it's crime or terrorism or something like this. Why isn't everyone constantly frightened about climate change every day? Is this a case of the frog being boiled very slowly?
Well, that's a good metaphor. The whole world is being boiled very slowly, not just the frog, although the frogs will be victims as well. No, but I think there's something else going on here, and it's something about the fact that we're evolved beings who have lived for untold generations in a world in which there was this risk of violence at the hands of other human beings, or perhaps at the hands of predatory animals too, for that matter. But mostly we deal with that threat. So, but violence at the hands of other human beings is something that we have, developed a fear of because it helps us to avoid being a victim of that violence. And so, when newspapers report crimes that arouses our interest in some way, because we have this evolved capacity to be fearful about this and to worry that this could happen to us, and so we read it avidly and we buy the newspapers or watch the TV news, and of course that increases the audience for advertising, so they do it more. Now, if you think about climate change, on the other hand, this has never been a problem until now, and we have no evolved mechanisms for detecting releases of greenhouse gases, and the fact that it's happening in the future is also something that we don't cope with that well. We've generally evolved to deal with immediate threats, not with distant threats, perhaps because we couldn't do so much about long-term futures in the past. So I think that that's what's going on, and that's why it doesn't feature as much in the news, because there aren't things that the news can use to actually arouse us emotionally in the same way that it can with, let's say, stories about crime. And
news is immediate rather than future-oriented, usually.
Yes, that's right, typically. And things that are there all the time. I mean, it's not only climate change, it's also, for example, global poverty. So there'll be a big headline about some unfortunate person who was brutally murdered in the city. There'll be no headline that says, today 20,000 families were lifted out of extreme poverty, and as a result of that, there will be 100 fewer children dying from some poverty-related disease, because that's actually happening every day. We are reducing the number of people in extreme poverty. We are reducing the number of children who die from poverty-related causes. Just since I wrote my book, The Life You Can Save, which was published in 2009, the number of children under 5 dying from avoidable poverty-related causes has fallen from 9.8 million to 5.9 million. So,
right.
That's an enormous change that's going on all the time. But the papers don't report it precisely because it is going on all the time.
Right. Just quickly, you said that news appeals to emotion. So I was just wondering, do you think it appeals to emotion rather than appealing to logic? And I would, as a guess, I would imagine that your philosophy almost deals exclusively in logic rather than emotion. It sounds like you appeal to people on logical grounds. What do you make of news appealing to people on emotional grounds?
I think a lot of news does appeal to people on emotional grounds,
right.
Because I think that does engage most people's interests more. I think we're a complex mix of reason and emotion. And,
right.
But in terms of motivating us to stay tuned to that channel, for example, probably for the majority of people, not for all, but probably for the majority of people, the fact that something is arousing your emotions is more likely to make you stay tuned than the fact that it's engaging your rational capacities. So this is a concern, and of course, you then raise the question, well, here am I, a philosopher, and I'm appealing to people's rational capacities.
Right.
But so I accept that my books are never going to sell at the same level as the best popular fiction that appeals to people's emotions.
No, only
in various
500,000 for
right.
for animal liberation.
Right, that's right, but not the multi-millions that Harry Potter or whoever sells.
I was joking.
But what you hope, of course, is that at some level of society, people making important decisions are more influenced by reasoning and logic, and of course the facts, proper understanding of evidence and what that points to, than by emotions. And this is one of the problems about whether democracy can actually continue to elect people who appeal to reason and logic against the sort of skilled opposition of people who are clearly appealing to emotions.
Okay. We might just shift gear once again, and similar on a political topic, but we'll talk about capitalism and consumer culture for now. So this I listened to you speak and on YouTube, and you were talking about Thanksgiving in the US and how to treat it and what it means for all of these hundreds of millions of people eating turkey. And I thought about, you mentioned the American dream, and I thought about, hey, what about, Australia? This is the lucky country. What does that actually mean? And I thought, the conception of Australia being the lucky country seems not to connote an escape from poverty, but to connote a movement towards a life of luxury. So do you think, to defeat this culture of meat eating and, lamb on the barbie and whatnot, do we need to redefine the image of Australia so that it's the lucky country, not because it's based on excessive consumption and, opulence, but it's based on something else? Do you think this redefinition needs to happen, and how?
I do think that it's important to have a sense of what's really good about Australia, and I think that is much more being able to treat people decently across the board in our society, being able to accept diversity and difference in our society and not use that as a weapon for casting people out and discriminating against them. So I think those are things to celebrate about Australian society. Not that we're at all perfect in those things, of course, but I think we, on the whole, make a reasonable fist of that.
Right.
And, yes, that we provide for all of our citizens, that we provide them with a minimal level of income, we provide them with housing, hopefully most of them anyway, if they need it. We provide them with education, we provide them with universal health care. Those are all things that are important. And living a life of luxury and indulgence, I think, is less important than the fact that everybody has sufficient.
Right. Okay.
And on that note of capitalism, I've often thought that one of the bases of Australian society or Western society more generally is competition. We're obsessed with watching athletes compete. We're also taught that we need to work hard, achieve more, study more, volunteer more, or else risk the masses overtaking us and us being a failure. So what effects do you think that this kind of constant competition have on our morals and also our well-being?
Well, competition has both good and bad effects, clearly. It has good effects because it does spur people to work harder and to do better. And if the system can use that for the benefit of all, so competition encourages students to study harder, let's say, and therefore they become better at whatever it is they're studying to do, whether it's being engineers or doctors or lawyers or philosophers, they do it better, then that's a positive. But of course it does have this side that somebody has to lose in these competitions, and then the question is that they're going to feel bad about themselves, and are they going to be able to continue to have a life in which they have reasonable self-esteem and in which they provide for themselves? So I think we need to be aware of that, and I think we need to make sure that the competition is such that there are reasonable options for those who don't do well in the competition, as well as perhaps inevitably somewhat better options for those who do well.
And so I think you've also been quoted as saying that capitalism is still the best system. So I think, could you just elaborate a tiny bit more on that?
Yeah, I think I would phrase it slightly differently. I would say we don't really know of a system that works better than capitalism on a large scale. So there may be better systems, and that's why I wouldn't just flat out say capitalism is the best system. I would say we haven't got another system that has been tried and shown to work better at a national level, let's say, as distinct from maybe smaller groups. And even smaller groups, haven't always worked that well when you try to introduce equality or socialism, something like that. You can think about the Israeli kibbutzim, which were idealistic, relatively small socialist communities, and basically most of them have lost their early idealism. So I think for people who say, well, capitalism is the root of all evil, then you need to say, well, what's the system that you want to replace it with, and how do we know that that's really going to work well? And until somebody answers that question satisfactorily, and then they also, of course, need to answer the further question of how are we going to actually replace capitalism with this better system. Until we do that, I think we ought to just accept that capitalism is here for the foreseeable future, and let's try to make it compatible with a decent life for everyone. Let's soften it around the edges, in other words. But let's not just dream of overthrowing it when there's lots of things that we can do to make the world better within a capitalist framework.
Right. And do you have any suggestions as to what the next great system can be?
No, I don't really. I mean, I suppose that I would like a more egalitarian system, one in which everybody could feel that they had a proper place and role, and it's difficult to make that compatible with capitalism because it does always mean that some will do better than others, and that people will be trying to profit from others and take advantage of them. But a capitalist economic system with a comprehensive social welfare system in place, providing those goods I mentioned for all, minimum income, universal healthcare, universal education. They seem to me to be about the best we could do. I mentioned minimal income, and there's a lot of research going on now about providing a universal basic income for all. And I think I'm following that kind of experimental projects in different parts of the world with some interest, because that may be a way of putting a floor as to, everybody is at least at this level, and then some will work harder and be more gifted and compete better and do significantly better than that. But at least everybody will have sufficient.
Okay.
Do you think that a universal basic income could potentially take away that incentive to work harder, though?
Well, that's clearly what people are concerned about, and that's what some of these pilot projects are actually testing. So, that's going on both in developed countries, affluent countries, and also in East Africa, where an organisation called Give Directly is trialling a minimal income. And the idea will then be to see whether when people get this minimal income, they work less hard and therefore their total income is not really greater, or they're not significantly better off and happier than they were before, or whether, in fact, it provides them with opportunities to do other things that mean that their lives are significantly better. And that's just a factual question. We can't really answer it out of theory. We need to look at the data, and when the data's all in, we'll have a better idea.
Do you believe that human beings are inherently selfish?
I think human beings typically have a tendency to be selfish, but they also have capacities to be unselfish, to be altruistic. So probably the selfish side of human nature is stronger because that's what our ancestors needed if they were to survive and reproduce and pass on their genes. If they had been entirely altruistic, then we wouldn't be here. So I suppose that makes my answer to your question, on the whole, yes, but not entirely so.
You mentioned evolution a couple of times there. Is this has Darwinian thought played a big role in the evolution of your own beliefs?
Yes, I think Darwinian thinking enables us to understand why we're like we are, And it's important for philosophers to understand human nature, especially if you're talking about changing social circumstances. You can't just do that as if we were somehow a tabula rasa that you could write on and do whatever you want. And arguably the problem with sort of egalitarian socialism or communism was that it thought that human nature was more flexible, more plastic than it really is, and it thought that if you throw out the capitalist system, then humans will suddenly become cooperative and unselfish. And obviously, if you look at the Soviet Union, that did not happen. So I do think that it's important to understand that we have evolved through some kind of competition for survival and for reproducing, and that has led to the inheritance within us of those qualities and characteristics which helped our ancestors to survive.
Okay. Speaking of qualities and characteristics, so there was this study done on American soldiers post-Vietnam War, and they were trying to measure, how well they were coping. And in one of the sections, they split them into college-educated and non-college educated. And they found that the college-educated soldiers were much better equipped to deal with the atrocities of war because, they were well-versed in reason and, logical thinking. So I guess the question I'm about to ask is tied to the importance of education. And possibly also, how do you think education, do you think it impinges on our capacity to be emotional? Because I guess the conclusion from this study was that college education equals reason. No college education equals, lesser ability to reason.
Yeah, I don't know how the study would actually control for the fact that the people who went to college might have had a better ability to reason in the first place.
Right.
So that could be part of the problem there.
Okay. It could just be a correlation.
Yeah, but I do think that developing capacities for reason and developing self-reflection and self-awareness about the role of emotions play in our own life, I think that that's useful for getting beyond merely being moved by our emotions. And I think it's very dangerous for people to simply rest with their emotions. It's dangerous both for them because there are powerful emotions that might be very bad for you, like pursuing revenge when you ought not to try to pursue revenge. That's a powerful emotion we have. But it's also bad for society because people may be led to do things that are really bad for others, because we familiar throughout history with this idea of groups doing things, getting together and carrying out all kinds of atrocities, which within the group at the time maybe seemed okay, or there were social pressures to participate in it, not to dissent from it, and yet then when we look back and we think, how could people have done those kinds of things?
Right. So on the topic of group or pack mentality, specifically with regards to toxic masculinity, how do you think this plays out in Australia? It seems like groups of men together can be pretty problematic.
I think we're actually making progress with that.
Right.
If you think Australian masculinity is toxic today, you should have seen it when I was an undergraduate. I think it was much worse.
Right.
And I think there are things today which we call out and object to, which nobody objected to before.
Right.
So I think what that shows is that you can make progress. You can bring up even Australian males to be more thoughtful, more considerate, more respectful of others, whether they're females in general or Australian males who don't fit the norm.
Right.
So yeah, I do think we can make progress with that.
Okay. Right. So on the topic of speaking or influencing large numbers of people as you have, have you ever felt as though the fame or popularity has gotten in the way of your life or of this adventure you've been on in philosophy?
No, I don't really think so. I think actually more often it's provided opportunities and open doors. I don't know, maybe my children have sometimes found it a bit annoying that people knew their father and had strong views about their father's view, but they seem to have got over it. They've turned out fine. So So, no, I don't really regret that.
Okay.
We note that you've been married for a whopping 50 years now. So
Almost.
Almost. Okay,
don't
so
count
49,
things.
49.
There's another, 5 months to go?
Okay.
We won't jinx it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
So what we wanted to ask was, are there any secrets you can reveal to any budding lovebirds listening to our show as to how to maintain such a long relationship?
One thing is, I think, and this is difficult to do when you're young, is to get together with somebody whose values are in some ways similar to yours. They're not identical, might be too boring, but at least that you can respect their values and the way they think about things so that you can talk about that. And hopefully, and this is, I think, the way it's worked with Renata, my wife, and myself, where those values have changed and developed, they've changed and developed more or less together in similar lines. So I think that's been an important part of our success in staying together. We're certainly not the same people that we were when we got married nearly 50 years ago, but we've changed in ways that have kept us close and compatible. So that's the first thing. The other thing is, I think we give each other a certain amount of space for doing our own things. We don't have identical interests, and we don't feel, I think, at one stage Paul and Linda McCartney said that after being together for many years that they'd never spent a night apart or something like that. That seems a bit claustrophobic to me. Yeah. I think, you do need to sometimes have some space for doing your own things, but, you stay close and respect what each other's doing.
So many people, including yourself, are very worried about the state of world politics at the moment, particularly with Trump, but also the rise of the far right gaining in popularity, particularly in parts of Europe. Are you hopeful that a better world for all is on its way, or are you concerned about increasing tribalism taking us down a dark path?
You'd have to be concerned in the light of developments, particularly the election of Donald Trump, but also the Brexit referendum, and then the election of right-wing governments in Hungary and Poland. But I'm less optimistic than I was, but I'm still remain on the whole positive. I'm encouraged by some of the by-election results in the United States, where the Democrats have done reasonably well, and I'm hopeful that they'll continue to do well at the midterm November elections for Congress. And that Trump will be a one-term president. If Trump is re-elected, I will have to reassess my optimism, I must admit. As far as Europe is concerned, it's not looking particularly good, but it's a mixed picture when you look at it. It's not the case that every country is going the way of those right-wing governments I mentioned.
Right.
And you've written that recently that a lot of wealthy countries might have a dilemma on their hands when it comes to accepting asylum seekers and refugees. Could you just outline this dilemma for us?
Yes. So I would like all asylum seekers to be accepted and be able to live somewhere where they can have good lives. But if the reality is that political parties that take that line, as, for example, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel did at one point when the many Syrian and other refugees were coming, if those parties are going to be then fail to get re-elected at their next elections, the result is worse than if they hadn't accepted them in the first place, because not only are asylum seekers and refugees and other immigrants going to be rejected, but also these governments, as we see very clearly with Trump, for instance, won't go ahead with the initiatives required to mitigate climate change, and they'll do many other things that are harmful. So I don't think you can actually stake everything on trying to educate the public to accept that every asylum seeker who lands on our shores has a right to stay. That seems to me, at least at present, and this is regrettable, but it seems to me to be going too far, to be pushing the electorate, trying to push the electorate somewhere where it's not willing to go. So I think that you do need to rethink some of those policies, and that might mean putting more funds into providing decent living conditions for refugees in their neighbouring countries. So, for example, in the case of Syria, there's very large numbers of refugees in Lebanon and Jordan, and if those countries had more support and were giving better or able to provide better lives to the Syrian refugees living there, maybe there'd be less pressure on them to come to Europe, and you could certainly and should accept some of them, but limited numbers that would be compatible with your population, your electorate, accepting that was the right thing to do rather than rejecting it and voting for these more nationalist opposition parties.
And on the topic of migration and immigration, I come from a migrant family, and
as do I.
As do you. And so I was going to ask, what was your experience like growing up in Australia as a migrant?
So I was not myself a migrant, but my parents were
family,
migrants, and so I was a first generation Australian. My experiences on the whole were pretty good. I mean, I was sometimes picked on because you wouldn't see it now, but I had very dark, almost black hair, and
I can't believe it.
Somewhat dark dark complexion, suntan sort of brown complexion. And at this stage, we're talking about the 1950s. Australians were still predominantly Anglo or Anglo-Celtic, so either they tended to be blonde and blue-eyed and fair-skinned, or they were more of that Irish red freckled sort of complexion, and I was neither of those. So it did happen to me as a child that I was sort of told things like, why don't you go back where you come from? But and maybe once or twice I was bullied for that, but no, not at a level that was really serious, I think.
Right.
That is a shame, though.
Yeah,
well,
it's
a shame that it happened at all, but, at least, as I say, I was able to go through with all of the things that I wanted to do, basically, and didn't stop me having a great life here.
Okay, so through your utilitarian philosophy, it sounds like you're dealing with the idea of equality of opportunity. What do you think about that, equality of opportunity?
So equality for me, whether it's equality of opportunity or any other kind of equality, is not the ultimate intrinsic good.
Right.
It's a means to the end of providing a happier and better life for all of those affected by it.
Right.
But in practice, I think equality of opportunity does go some way towards doing that, because it enables people to do their best and to make the most of their capacities, and for those capacities to be used for the good of all. The downside of equality of opportunity is that some people are just better equipped, I think, if you like, innately better equipped to take advantage of certain opportunities. Let's say we're talking about opportunities to go to university. Some people are more gifted at taking the kinds of tests that get you into university.
So same dilemma as capitalism then?
Exactly. It's similar to capitalism. So again, you need the kind of the welfare net or the universal basic income that puts a floor under everyone and says, look, even if you cannot succeed in the kind of race that equality of opportunity provides, we're still going to make sure that you have a decent minimum.
Great. And on our last serious note, a listener has asked us which news outlets you rely on for information and why. Okay, so I suppose the thing I read most regularly is the New York Times, which I read online, and I think is a newspaper that checks its facts reasonably carefully, which is not to say that it doesn't ever get things wrong. It certainly sometimes does. I think it was misled by the George W. Bush administration about whether there were likely to be weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, for example. But I still think it's one of the better news sources. I look at the BBC as well, and because I am Australian, I look at the ABC here. I do look at The Age as well because I want some local stuff, but I think The Age has really fallen far below the levels that I thought it. Maybe I was under an illusion, but I thought, when I was younger, that The Age was a pretty reputable paper that took a serious approach to the world. It's much harder to see it that way today.
What do you think about the 9 Fairfax merger on the note of The Age?
Well, as I say, if The Age were what it was 40 years ago, I would be much more worried about that because I would think we were losing serious independent journalism. But so much of the Age now leads with murders and car crashes and so on that I don't know that it's that big a gap between where the Age is now and where Nine is. Of course, the other issue is what consolidation of the media does, and I regret that, but I think you just have to face the fact that it's really hard for newspapers to be profitable nowadays. And Fairfax, again, I think the other difference between the Age now and the Age 40 years ago is that the Saturday Age used to be a really heavy paper full of ads for cars and employment and houses, and now that's basically gone online. So it's understandable why the Age can't pay for as much of a reporting staff as it used to. And I guess if it's going to survive, maybe it has to merge with someone else.
And you mentioned the ABC before. Are you in favour of cutting funding to the ABC as has been proposed recently, or are you much against that?
I think you know the answer to that.
Yeah, perhaps.
I'm very much against it. And I think the ABC is a great institution still. I wish it were better funded. I wish it could be more like the BBC, which I think is still a step above the
But don't
ABC.
take it out of the foreign aid budget, whatever you do.
No, I wouldn't take it out of the foreign aid budget, but I think we definitely need it. And at the other level, living part of the year in the United States, I see how National Public Radio there, which gets very little, public funding, gets and relies to some extent on listener subscriptions and so on. And the public broadcasting system there are just, they really cannot have the same sort of reporting capacities that either the BBC or the ABC has, and that's a real pity in the United States because it does leave things in the hands of the privately owned media. And even though, as I say, the New York Times does a pretty good job with that, there's a lot of other places that don't have a newspaper that does a good job.
Okay, and lastly, I had a few friends message me to ask you to confirm whether or not your diet consists exclusively of potatoes.
So is this because they saw something about this?
I think it was a word on the street.
Word on the street.
Word on the street, really? That's very funny because I got this request not long ago from a guy whose name I've now forgotten, but if you Google Spud Fit, you can find him, who asked me for a recipe for a potato recipe for a book he's compiling of recipes just for potatoes. And he's someone who weighed, I think if I remember rightly, 155 kilos and was very unfit.
Right.
And decided that he would eat just potatoes for a year.
I've heard about this.
And,
I've heard about
this, right?
Yeah.
And he lost 55 kilos or something and got fitter, and he's now a great advocate for spuds. But as far as I'm concerned, no, I enjoy spuds quite a lot, but it's certainly not my only diet at all. I eat a lot of fruit and a lot of veggies in particular.
And so it keeps you in good
tofu
shape.
and all sorts of things. Pasta.
Do you have that famous potato recipe for us now on the top of your head? Or
I can tell you what it is. I can't tell you all the ingredients. So it's for this Szechuan sort of shredded potato dish. Are you familiar with that?
Right, yeah.
So you get these potatoes, basically you cut them into sort of matchstick-like strips, and you stir-fry them with some oil and chilies and I think maybe Szechuan pepper, or chili, something like that, and perhaps a few capsicums as well you put in, but it's basically a potato dish. But you don't boil them first, and so you're really only stir-frying them, so they remain kind of crispy, not the texture that we're used to with potatoes.
The singer's secret.
I think it's a great dish. So if I'm sure you can look it up and find the actual ingredients or a variety of different ways of doing it. But I've made it a few times. It's not that hard to make. It has a bit of vinegar in it too. That's the other ingredient.
Okay, don't forget the vinegar.
Don't forget.
All right, I think that's pretty much all we have time for, Peter. Thank you very much for joining us. It's been a pleasure.